The children were drawing in the dirt. Over and over, the same strange symbol. Boone Carter couldn't make heads or tails of it, but the way their little hands clawed at the soil told him this wasn't some childish game. There was an urgency to it, a desperation that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He'd pulled them from the raging river just 12 hours ago, right in the guts of the worst storm he'd seen in a decade. They should have been crying. They should have been clinging to him, terrified. But they weren't. Instead, they just kept staring at the horizon, like they were waiting for an appointment. The girl, she couldn't have been more than 8, had a small leather pouch hanging from her neck. Every few minutes her hand would go to it, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. She'd peek inside just for a second, then snap it shut. Checking on something she was willing to die for in that freezing water. The boy was younger, maybe 6, but his eyes were ancient. They held a look that made Boone's blood run cold. It was a look that said he knew things a child shouldn't know. A look that said he'd seen this all before. When the storm finally blew itself out, Boone thought the worst was over. He was wrong. Dead wrong. Because with the first weak rays of sunrise, he heard it. A low rumble that wasn't thunder. It was the sound of hooves. A lot of hooves. The rhythmic, earth-shaking pounding of 100 horses moving as one. The children stopped drawing. They looked at each other, and the look that passed between them wasn't fear. It was recognition. And in that gut-freezing moment, Boone realized the symbol they'd been scratching into the ground wasn't just a random doodle. It was a message, a signal. But who was it for? And was it meant to save him, or was it a warning of his own impending doom? He was about to find out. Boone snatched his rifle from the pegs above the cabin door. His hands, usually steady as a rock, trembled as he broke it open to check the chamber. 3 bullets. He had 3 bullets left. 3 bullets against what sounded like an entire army bearing down on his tiny, isolated ranch. The children had gone unnervingly still. The girl's hand was a white-knuckled fist around her leather pouch. The boy, he'd crept to the window, his small face pressed against the dusty glass. Neither of them looked scared, and that scared Boone more than anything else. "Get away from there, kid," Boone hissed, yanking the boy back just as the first riders crested the ridge. His heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't just a few riders, it was a sea of them. Warriors, 100 at least, moving in perfect, terrifying formation. A cloud of dust billowed behind them, swallowing the horizon. At their head rode a man who sat his horse like a king on a throne, tall, proud, his feathers catching the new morning light. Boone's mind spun. He'd been on this land for 8 years, ever since his wife, Ruth, had passed. He'd kept to himself, kept the peace with the local tribes. He traded fair, he respected their boundaries, he never caused trouble. So why were they here? Why now? The answer was standing right beside him. 2 small children he'd pulled from a flash flood. 2 children he'd given his last bit of bread to. 2 children who, apparently, belonged to a man important enough to bring an army to his doorstep. The girl took a small step forward and put her hand on Boone's arm. She looked up at him, her dark eyes holding the wisdom of an old woman, and pointed a tiny finger at the symbol in the dirt. In the morning light, it was clearer. 3 wavy lines, bisected by 1 single straight mark. The river, maybe, and the straight line. Was that his fence? His property line? A border they were about to cross? The thunder of the hooves was deafening now. They'd be on him in minutes. The boy tugged on his shirt, pointing frantically toward the back of the cabin, toward the root cellar. He was telling him to hide them, but that would be an admission of guilt. How could he prove he was a savior, not a kidnapper, if he was found cowering in a hole in the ground? The girl must have read his mind. She shook her head, a single firm gesture. She walked to the front door and laid her palm flat against the weathered wood. She wanted to face them. She wanted him to face them. The ground itself was vibrating now. Boone could feel it through the soles of his worn-out boots. He could see their faces, grim and set for battle. And leading them all, the chief, the father of the children standing beside him, a man who had every reason to believe the white man in the cabin had stolen his flesh and blood. The lead warrior raised his hand, a simple, fluid motion, and 100 horses stopped dead. The silence that fell was more terrifying than the charge had been. It was a heavy, waiting silence. Boone took a breath, his lungs burning. He'd made his choice. He stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held low, not threatening, but not hidden either. The children moved with him, flanking him like tiny bodyguards. The girl on his right, the boy on his left. Their presence was a strange mix of comfort and condemnation. The chief swung down from his horse with an easy grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. He was younger than Boone expected, maybe mid-30s, his arms corded with muscle and laced with the thin white lines of old scars. His eyes, dark and piercing, took in everything. The small cabin, the empty corral, the sad little vegetable patch Ruth had tried to keep alive. They were the eyes of a judge, weighing every detail of Boone's life. When those eyes finally landed on Boone, he felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. This was a man used to command, a man who could end Boone's life with a flick of his wrist. But then the chief's gaze fell upon the children, and everything changed. The hard mask of a warrior shattered. Raw, unfiltered relief washed over his face, and for a heartbeat, he wasn't a chief. He was just a father who had found his lost children. The girl couldn't wait. She broke from Boone's side and ran, her small legs pumping, crying out a single word in a language Boone didn't know, but a meaning he understood perfectly. "Papa!" The chief dropped to one knee, a sudden, ungraceful movement, and swept both children into a fierce embrace, burying his face in their wet hair. Boone heard him murmuring to them, soft, desperate words that needed no translation. Behind him, some of the warriors visibly relaxed, their hands loosening on their weapons. But the reunion was short-lived. The chief stood, his face becoming a mask of stone once more as he turned his attention back to Boone. He spoke, his English careful and heavily accented. "I am Kestrel of the Northern Wind. These are my children." Boone swallowed, his throat dry as dust. "I'm Boone Carter. I pulled them from the river during the storm yesterday." Kestrel's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "My children do not go near the river alone. They know its dangers." The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. If they didn't go to the river on their own, then someone must have taken them. Someone like the lone white man whose property the river ran through. The girl, Ayana, stepped forward. She began to speak in a rush of her own language, her small hands flying as she gestured at Boone, at the dark, churning river, then up at the sky. She was telling the story. Boone's entire life now rested on the words of an 8-year-old girl, and he couldn't understand a single one. Kestrel listened, his face an unreadable granite cliff. When she finally fell silent, he knelt and looked at the leather pouch in her hands, the one she'd guarded so fiercely. He took it from her gently and opened the clasp. He tipped the contents into his palm. It was a small piece of bone, yellowed with age, intricately carved with symbols. Kestrel stared at it, and his face went white. All the color drained from him, as if he'd seen a ghost. Whatever that small piece of bone was, it changed everything. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. The chief stood up very slowly, and when he looked at Boone this time, it wasn't with suspicion or gratitude. It was with something else. Something cold and terrifying that made the sweat on Boone's back turn to ice. "Where," Kestrel asked, his voice a deadly quiet whisper, "did you find my children?" About 2 miles downstream, Boone managed, his voice hoarse. They were caught in the rocks, near Devil's Bend. Kestrel's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. Devil's Bend is sacred ground. No one goes there, especially not children. He held the carved bone in his open palm. It seemed to throb with a dark energy, a meaning that was just beyond Boone's grasp. Someone sent them there, Kestrel said, his voice low and guttural. Someone who wanted them to find this. He held the bone aloft for his warriors to see. A nervous murmur rippled through the assembled men. They shifted on their horses, whispering to one another. Whatever that bone signified, it was a powerful and dangerous thing. This, Kestrel said, his voice ringing with authority and grief, belonged to my father. He died 3 winters ago. He was buried with it at Devil's Bend, as is our custom. Boone felt the floor drop out from under him. The children hadn't just trespassed. They had disturbed a grave, a chief's grave. They were not just led there. Kestrel's dark eyes bored into him. They were told exactly where to dig, by someone who knows our ways, our sacred places, our language. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with brutal force. Someone had used these innocent children, used them to desecrate a grave. They knew the storm was coming. They knew the children would be swept away, and they knew whose cabin they would wash up at. "You think I did it?" Boone asked, the words catching in his throat. "You think I sent them?" Kestrel's answer was a shock. "No, you do not have the cunning for such a plan. And your eyes, they do not lie when you speak of the rescue." He took a step closer, the bone still resting in his palm like a terrible judgment. "But someone wants me to think you did. Someone knows that for a white man to be found with my father's grave marker, it would demand a blood payment." Boone's mouth went dry. "Blood payment?" "Our law is absolute," Kestrel stated, his voice as cold as a winter wind. "Disturb the sacred rest of a chief, and your life is forfeit." A low growl of agreement came from the 100 warriors behind him. "That is why they chose this bone," Kestrel continued, his gaze sweeping over the horizon. "They wanted me to ride here today. They wanted me to kill you." Just then, the girl, Ayana, tugged at her father's sleeve. She spoke again, her voice urgent and low. She pointed a small, trembling finger toward the low hills that bordered Boone's property. Her hands made motions, like someone hiding, watching from the trees. Kestrel's face grew even grimmer. "Ayana says they were followed. A man on a horse, hidden among the trees. She thought he was a hunter. Now we know he was a shepherd, guiding his flock to the slaughter." "Making sure they found the bone," Boone finished, the horror of the scheme washing over him. "And making sure they fell in the river, so I'd be the one to find them." "Bringing my father's spirit into your house," Kestrel said, his voice laced with venom. "Making you a thief, without you even knowing it." Boone raked a hand through his hair, his mind reeling. "Someone went to all that trouble just to get me killed? But why? I'm nobody." "That," Kestrel said, his eyes scanning the hills his daughter had indicated, "is what we must find out." He barked a series of sharp commands in his own tongue. Instantly, half the warriors wheeled their horses around and galloped toward the hills, fanning out to search for tracks. "You believe them?" Boone asked, looking at the 2 small, solemn children. "You believe your own children were used like that?" "Ayana has her grandmother's eyes," Kestrel said without looking at him. "She sees what others miss. And Takakota." He glanced at his son, who was now staring intently at the symbol he'd drawn in the dirt. He remembers. He remembers everything exactly as it happened." As if on cue, the boy looked up. He looked past his father, past Boone, and spoke in clear, if halting, English. "Man had scar, here." With a small, dirty finger, he traced a line down his own left cheek. Kestrel froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. "What did you say?" he whispered. Takakota's voice was small, but it carried in the tense silence. Scarman. He told us. Grandfather's spirit is calling from the river. The chief's hands curled into tight fists. Several of his warriors, who had overheard the boy, let out sharp cries and reached for their weapons. You know him, Boone said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Kestrel snarled, the single word dripping with years of hatred. And if I am right, this was never about you at all. Just then, a warrior came thundering back from the hills, shouting as he rode. Kestrel listened, his face darkening with every word. When the warrior finished, Kestrel turned to Boone. They found tracks, a single horse, shod with iron, heading east, toward Millfield. Boone knew Millfield. It was a 2-day ride, a dusty territorial outpost where government officials bought and sold land and settled disputes. Who is he? Boone pressed. Who's the man with the scar? Kestrel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze resting on his children, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of their faces. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. His name is Marcus Gann. 5 years ago, he was a translator for the territorial government. During the treaty talks. He paused, his jaw tightening. He was a translator until we discovered he was twisting our words, lying. Treaties we signed, believing they protected our sacred hunting grounds, actually signed them away. The river, the burial sites. Devil's Bend, Boone breathed, the final piece clicking into place. When we discovered his deception and protested, the officials sided with him. They said we had agreed to the terms. It was Gann's word against ours. Kestrel's voice dropped, becoming hard and sharp. But my father was at every meeting. He was a keeper of records. He wrote down everything, in our own language. He had proof that Gann was a liar. Proof that was buried with him, as is our tradition. Kestrel held up the carved bone again. This marker, it has symbols that point to the location of those records within his grave. Gann knows this. He knows that if anyone ever found my father's resting place, his entire world of lies would be exposed. The sheer diabolical brilliance of the plan was staggering. So he uses your own children to disturb the grave. Boone pieced it together out loud. He knows you'll follow your law. You'll come for the person holding the sacred object, and you'll kill them. Me. And with me dead, the only person who knows the location of the grave is silenced forever. The site remains a secret, and his forged treaties stand. And he is free to claim more of our land for his government friends, Kestrel added, his eyes burning with a cold fire as he stared in the direction of Millfield. Ayanna ran to her father's side and whispered something else, her small face tight with concentration. A fresh wave of fury washed over Kestrel's features. What is it? Boone asked. What did she say? Kestrel's voice was barely a whisper, but it was more dangerous than any shout. Gann told them. He told them that if they brought the bone to the white rancher by the river, their grandfather's spirit would finally be at peace. He looked at his children, his heart breaking in his eyes. He used their love for my father to turn them into pawns in his game. He made them desecrate a grave, believing they were setting a spirit free. A sudden shout from the perimeter made every head turn. The warriors returning from the hills. They were riding hard, and they were not alone. Wedged between two powerful war horses was a third rider on a tired-looking nag. His hands were bound behind his back, and even from 100 yards away, Boone could see the pale, ugly scar that snaked down his left cheek. Marcus Gann hadn't made it to Millfield after all. As the warriors dragged him into the clearing, Gann's eyes darted around, assessing the situation like a cornered snake. He looked from Kestrel's stony face to Boone's rifle, his mind clearly racing, searching for an escape route, a lie that would fit. When he spoke, his voice was as smooth as river stone, polished with years of deception. Chief Kestrel, thank the heavens. I've been riding all night searching for your children. I am so relieved to see they are safe." Kestrel stepped forward, and the air around him seemed to hum with contained violence. Every one of his 100 warriors leaned forward in their saddles, waiting for a signal. "You were searching for them?" Kestrel asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Of course," Gan said, putting on a show of earnest concern. "When I saw that terrible storm rolling in, I knew they might be in danger. I've been checking every homestead from here to the territorial line." It was a good lie. A plausible lie. Without the testimony of 2 small children, it was a lie that might have worked. Kestrel closed the distance between them until he was close enough to smell the sweat and fear on the man. "My son says you spoke with them yesterday. He says you told them their grandfather's spirit was calling to them from the river." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Gan's face. The boy, he must be confused. Children imagine all sorts of things, especially after a frightful experience like a storm. "Show him," Kestrel commanded, his voice like the crack of a whip. One of the warriors dismounted, strode to Gan's horse, and unstrapped his saddlebags. He dumped the contents onto the dusty ground, surveying tools, official-looking territorial documents, and a leather pouch, identical to the one Ayana carried. The warrior opened the pouch and tipped out its contents. More carved bones. Gan's face turned the color of ash. Kestrel picked up one of the bones, his expression unreadable. Each one was carved with the same ancient symbols as the one from his father's grave. "I can explain," Gan sputtered, his composure shattering. "I found those by the river, scattered. I was gathering them to return to you, knowing their importance to your people." Kestrel held up one of the bones, turning it slowly in the morning light. "This one belonged to my grandfather's grandfather. It has not seen the sun in 60 years. His voice dropped to a terrifying whisper. "You have been robbing our graves." "That's not true. Be silent!" Kestrel's command was a physical force, cutting off Gan's protest. He turned to his son. "Takakota, tell this man what he said to you." The little boy stepped forward, his small frame trembling, but his voice steady and clear. "Scarman said, 'Grandfather's bones make powerful medicine for white men.' He said, 'If we bring them to the rancher, we get reward money.' He said grandfather wants his bones to help us." Gan looked like he'd been punched in the gut. His carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "The boy is lying. He's confused. Children don't understand these things." Kestrel turned his cold gaze to his daughter. "Ayana, what else did this man tell you?" The girl looked directly at Gan, her eyes filled with a righteous fury that belied her age. She spoke in careful, deliberate English. "He said you would be proud of us. He said bringing the bones to the white man would show we trust the white man. He said it would make peace." The sheer cruelty of the manipulation was breathtaking. He hadn't just used them. He had twisted their deepest desires, to honor their ancestors, to please their father, into weapons for his own greedy schemes. Boone couldn't stay silent any longer. His own anger, hot and clean, boiled over. "You used children to rob graves. You made them believe they were heroes, while you set me up to be murdered for your crimes." Gan sneered, a sliver of his arrogance returning. "You don't understand the complexities of the law, rancher. These artifacts belong in a museum for study, not rotting in the dirt. I was preserving history." "Whose history?" Kestrel asked quietly. "American history." Gan shot back, his mask of civility slipping away entirely. "Civilized history. This land is going to be developed sooner or later. Your primitive superstitions can't stand in the way of progress." Several warriors surged forward, their weapons raised, but Kestrel held up a hand, stopping them in their tracks. "You forged the treaties," Boone said, the accusation flat and hard. "You changed the words to steal their land." I corrected them, Gan spat, his voice rising with defiance. I made them reflect the reality of the situation. It was going to happen anyway. I just sped up the process. He then made a fatal mistake. He looked directly at Kestrel, his face twisted with contempt. And when your father and his ridiculous records threatened to undo all my hard work, I made sure they would stay buried forever. He was a stubborn old fool who refused to accept that his time was over. The words hung in the air, an unforgivable insult. Boone saw Kestrel's hand go to the knife at his belt. He saw the murder in his eyes. But before the chief could move, a shout went up from the edge of the clearing. More riders, approaching from the east, and from their uniforms, they were territorial officials. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Gan's face. You see, he said, his voice dripping with smug relief. The proper authorities have arrived. This will all be handled through official channels now. But as Kestrel looked from the approaching officials to the damning evidence in his hands, then back to Gan, his expression wasn't one of defeat. It was one of grim satisfaction. Perhaps, he said softly. But first, they will hear exactly what you have done. Gan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. My word against a bunch of savages and a dirt-poor rancher? I like my chances. His confidence faltered, though, when he saw Boone slowly pull a folded piece of paper from his pocket. The territorial survey notice that had been nailed to his fence post just last week. A notice that authorized an official land assessment. A notice that bore Marcus Gan's signature. The territorial officials, led by a portly, silver-haired man named Commissioner Walsh, rode into the tense clearing with the easy arrogance of men who believed they held all the power. I'm Commissioner Walsh, he announced, his eyes sweeping over the scene with deep disapproval. We had a report of an armed gathering here, disturbing the peace. Gan, still bound, puffed out his chest. Commissioner, thank God. These savages have taken me prisoner. They're making wild accusations, threatening my life over some tribal misunderstanding. Walsh's gaze shifted from the 100 silent warriors to the bound translator, and finally to Boone, who stood firm with the 2 children at his side. Mr. Gan, your survey reports were due in Millfield yesterday. When you failed to arrive, we came looking for you. As you can see, Commissioner, I was unavoidably detained, Gan said with a pained expression. Kestrel stepped forward, holding out the handful of carved bones for Walsh to see. Commissioner, this man has not been detained. He has been caught. He has been robbing our sacred burial sites and used my own children to do it. That's preposterous, Gan blustered. They're just angry about the new land assessments. They're trying to interfere with legitimate government business. Walsh took one of the bones, his expression unreadable. These do seem to be authentic artifacts, Mr. Gan. Part of an official archaeological survey, are they? Yes, in a way, Gan stammered, his story shifting. I found them, you see, scattered along the riverbank. I was bringing them in for proper cataloging when I was ambushed. That's when Boone stepped forward, unfolding the paper in his hand. Commissioner, this is a survey notice for my property. It authorizes an assessment for potential territorial acquisition. It's signed by Mr. Gan. Walsh took the paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. Yes, this appears to be in order. The survey was conducted yesterday, Boone continued, his voice steady. But Mr. Gan here claims he was out searching for these children all night, and that he only found these bones by accident this morning. He can't have been doing both. The direct contradiction hung in the air like a noose. Walsh looked from the official document to the squirming translator, his eyes hardening. Mr. Gan, a clarification, if you please. When exactly did you conduct the survey of this property? The dates. There may have been a clerical error. Gan's voice trailed off. There is no error, Ayana said, her voice small but clear as a bell. Scarman came to our village 3 days ago. He told us the story about grandfather's bones. Walsh's head snapped toward the girl. Are you saying Mr. Gan was in your tribal village 3 days before the storm? Yes, Takakota added. He told us the secret, how the bones would make peace. The commissioner's face was turning a dangerous shade of red as the pieces of the puzzle began to form a very ugly picture in his mind. Mr. Gan, he said, his voice dangerously low, if you were at the tribal encampment 3 days ago, how could you have been conducting a survey here yesterday, a survey which you now claim prevented you from searching for these children? Gan's web of lies was tearing apart at the seams. The children are mistaken. The trauma of being lost in the storm has affected their memories. Both of them? Walsh asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. With the exact same, detailed, false memory? Commissioner, Kestrel said quietly, there is more you need to see. He gestured to one of his warriors, who brought forward the rest of the contents from Gan's saddlebags. More documents, detailed maps of other sacred burial grounds, and, most damning of all, a ledger, a list of names of territorial officials, and next to them, notations of payments. Bribes for looking the other way, for expediting fraudulent land claims. Walsh's name, thankfully, was not on the list, but the names of several of his colleagues were. The color drained from the commissioner's face as he scanned the ledger. Mr. Gan, this suggests a widespread conspiracy, grave robbery, bribery, corruption. Research, Gan insisted, his voice cracking with desperation. Those are just my private research notes, an academic study of burial customs. But it was over. The evidence was irrefutable. The children's testimony, the contradictory timeline, the stolen artifacts, and now a ledger detailing his crimes in his own handwriting. Walsh looked up from the papers, the look on his face that of a man who has just found a nest of vipers in his own house. Marcus Gan, you are under arrest for fraud, for theft of tribal artifacts, and for corruption of a territorial official. As Walsh's men moved in to replace the rawhide bonds with iron manacles, Gan made one last desperate appeal. Commissioner, you're making a terrible mistake. This is a setup. They've coerced this rancher. They've coached the children. They're trying to undermine the authority of the United States government. Walsh simply held up the ledger. Is this their handwriting, Mr. Gan? Or is it yours? Did they invent the records of the payments you received? The children's story is heartbreakingly consistent. Who coached them, Mr. Gan? This rancher, who has never left his property. This chief who didn't even know you were a criminal until this morning? Gan's face twisted into a mask of pure hatred as the last of his lies withered and died. Fine, he screamed. Yes, I changed the treaties. I took the bones. I did it to protect American interests, to bring progress to this wasteland. These savages don't deserve this land. They don't know what to do with it. The confession, raw and ugly, hung in the silent air. Kestrel stepped forward, his posture radiating a cold, deadly calm. Commissioner Walsh, by your own laws, this man has confessed to his crimes. Desecration, theft, fraud. What is the penalty for such things? Walsh looked deeply uncomfortable. He will face the territorial court. He will likely go to prison for a very long time. And the treaties. The land claims he falsified. That will require a lengthy and complicated legal review. And while your lawyers review, Kestrel said, his voice soft but edged with steel, my people will continue to live on scraps of land, while their ancestral homes, the places where their fathers are buried, are sold off to settlers. The commissioner had no answer to that. The weight of the injustice was too heavy. And in that moment, Boone heard himself speak, the idea forming even as the words left his mouth. What if there's another way? Every eye in the clearing turned to him. My property, Boone said, looking from Walsh to Kestrel. It runs along the river for 3 miles. It includes access to Devil's Bend, the grazing rights, the water rights. It was never mine to begin with. Not really. What are you suggesting, Mr. Carter? Walsh asked, a flicker of hope in his eyes. A trade, Boone said, looking directly at Kestrel. Instead of years in a courtroom, why don't we just fix it? Right here, right now. Draw a new line on the map. Give back what was stolen. Kestrel stared at him, a new, profound respect dawning in his eyes. You would give up your land? It's not giving up something that was never truly mine, Boone said, gesturing to the small, lonely cabin behind him. I don't need all this. I never did. But where will you go? Walsh asked, confused. Boone looked at the two children who had, in the span of a single day, turned his entire world upside down. He thought of the long, silent years since Ruth had died, the emptiness of the cabin. I've been alone out here for a long time, he said softly. Maybe it's time I found a new way to live. Ayanna, who had been listening intently, tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered in his ear. A slow smile spread across Kestrel's face, the first genuine smile Boone had ever seen from him. It transformed his entire demeanor. My daughter asks, Kestrel said, his voice warm with emotion, if the man who saved their lives would consider becoming our family. The offer hit Boone like a physical blow. Family. A word he thought he'd never hear again. What? What would that mean? He asked, his voice thick. It means a home in our village, Kestrel said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. It means work that has purpose. It means a future with two children who already see you as a hero. He glanced at his daughter, then back at Boone. And it means a chance to be a bridge between our people, to make sure men like Marcus Gann can never again poison the well of trust between us. Walsh watched the exchange, the relief on his face palpable. A voluntary land transfer, a peaceful resolution. It was a political miracle. Mr. Carter, he said formally, are you absolutely certain about this? Boone looked at his small, lonely ranch, at the fence that had marked the boundary of his isolation, at the river that had brought him this impossible choice. And then he looked at the family standing before him. Commissioner, he said, a smile finally breaking through his own weary features. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. 3 months later, Boone Carter sat on the bank of the river at Devil's Bend. The sun was warm on his face. In the shallows, Ayanna and Takakota splashed and played, their laughter echoing in the quiet canyon. Their grandmother watched them from the shade of a cottonwood tree. The sacred ground had been reconsecrated, the stolen artifacts returned to their eternal rest. Commissioner Walsh had kept his word. Marcus Gann was serving a 10-year sentence in a territorial prison. The fraudulent treaties were nullified, the lands were returned, and the 3 other corrupt officials on Gann's list had been quietly dismissed. Boone's old cabin still stood, empty. Kestrel had declared it neutral ground, a place where tribal elders and territorial officials could meet, a symbol of the new trust being built. You are thinking too loudly again, my friend, Kestrel said, sitting down on the grass beside him. Just remembering, Boone said. The storm, the warriors, the choice. He watched the children, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. When I pulled them out of that water, I thought I was just saving 2 lives. You saved more than 2 lives, Kestrel said, his gaze following Boone's. You saved my family. You saved our sacred lands. You saved the truth. Anyone would have done the same, Boone said, though he wasn't so sure. No, Kestrel's voice was firm. Not anyone. It took courage to jump into that river, but it took a different kind of courage to stand on your porch when 100 warriors arrived. It took courage to trust a man who had every reason to kill you. And it took the greatest courage of all to give away your home to right a wrong that was not of your making. Boone just smiled. Best trade I ever made. And it was true. His new life was fuller than he could have imagined. He was a counselor, a negotiator, a teacher. They called him Bridge Builder. He was teaching the children to read English, and they were teaching him their language, their history, their ways. "Papa Boone!" Ayanna shouted from the river's edge. "Come look! We found something!" They walked down to the water where the children were crouched over a small patch of sand. "It is a turtle's nest," Takakota announced, his English getting better every day. "Grandmother says they will hatch when the leaves turn. They are waiting, just like we were waiting for you." Boone knelt down, looking at the small, perfect depression in the sand, a hidden promise of new life. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. His own new life had been born from the chaos of that storm, from a choice made in a single, terrifying moment. "We'll have to protect them," he said softly. "Make sure they get to the water safely." Ayanna took his hand, her small fingers warm in his. "Just like you protected us," she said. Kestrel put a heavy, comforting hand on Boone's shoulder. "Come, my brother. The council is meeting. They wish to hear your thoughts on the new trading post." As they walked back toward the village, Boone glanced over his shoulder one last time. The children playing, the sacred ground at peace, the river flowing calmly under the sun. A poor rancher had found a family. A warrior chief had found justice. And two worlds, once set on a path of conflict, had found a bridge. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen to watch another tale where an unexpected act of kindness changes the course of history. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story from the edge of the wild. Your support helps us keep these legends alive.